The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer above the ICU at St. Michael's, a sound Laura Bennett had learned to filter out years ago, back when she could afford to notice things like ambient noise. Now she moved through Bay 7 with the kind of efficiency that came from having done this before, not in a hospital, but in a field station outside Kandahar where the difference between precision and panic meant someone's child got to grow up. Her hands checked Colonel Webb's central line with the steadiness of someone who had performed this procedure under mortar fire, the foot tubing cool and smooth against her fingertips as she verified the drip rate. 70 milliliters per hour. Stable. His chest rose and fell with the mechanical assistance of the ventilator, and she noted the slight dusky pallor around his lips, not ideal, but not yet critical. The monitor beside his bed beeped its steady rhythm, sinus tachycardia at 94 beats per minute, blood pressure holding at 118/76. Not good enough, but not the worst part of her shift. Not yet. The nurse who thinks she knows better than the residents. That was the whisper she'd caught in the supply room at 05 for 5 this morning, the kind of gossip that traveled faster than any virus through hospital corridors. She'd been reaching for the box of 18-gauge angiocath needles when 2 third-year residents passed by outside, their voices carrying that particular brand of arrogance that only med school debt and a white coat could cultivate. Laura had stood motionless, the needle box suspended halfway to the shelf, listening. They were talking about her question during yesterday's morning rounds, a simple one, really. Just asking why Dr. Mercer had ordered another cardiac panel for Mrs. Chen when the previous panel from Tuesday showed no abnormalities and the patient was recovering beautifully from her appendectomy. Mercer had turned the color of old rust and announced to the gathered residents that the question itself demonstrated the limitations of nursing education, and somehow that comment had metastasized into the narrative that she was overstepping, that she was a problem nurse, the kind who needed watching. Laura had set the needle box down quietly and moved to the next task. Survival was a matter of taking the hits without flinching. She'd survived worse. The parking lot outside had been dark when she arrived for the 2100 to 0700 shift, the Colorado Springs sky hanging low and gray like a bruise, and she'd walked past 3 news vans clustered near the main entrance before she understood what was happening. Colonel Marcus Webb. The name had appeared in the hospital census update at 1930, flagged urgent, critical care level, and her stomach had done that thing where it stopped existing for a moment. She knew that name the way you know the name of someone who replaced you, who wore your boots after your feet had been deemed too much of a liability by the Pentagon. 3 years ago, after the operation in Kandahar went sideways, the classified one that nobody was supposed to acknowledge, the one that had cost her spotter Davies his life and cost her the existence everyone pretended she'd never had, they told her she was too much of a security risk to remain on active duty. Not discharged, not honored, not even documented. Erased. Redacted out of official records like a name cut from a photograph. They'd offered her a pension under a classified name and suggested she find civilian work. Start over. Become invisible. And here she was, checking the vitals of the man who'd stepped into her role, his Delta Force credentials still warm with the mission she would never acknowledge taking. Laura had stood in the ICU threshold for exactly 3 seconds at 2107 when she saw him, same jawline as his service photo, thinner now, the kind of weight loss that came from acute illness rather than anything deliberate. His chart indicated a thoracic aortic aneurysm, discovered during a routine physical after he'd returned from operations. The surgeons were debating timing. The aneurysm was contained but expanding, and if it ruptured, he would have maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest. Laura had felt her hand steady. This was no different from field work. Observation, assessment, data collection. She could do invisible better than anyone. She checked his monitor, adjusted his flow rate, and reviewed his medication list with the kind of detachment she'd perfected. His eyes had been closed, the sedatives keeping him under, and she was grateful for that. If he woke, he might recognize something in her movements, the way she secured lines with combat-efficient knots, the way she calculated drip rates in her head without whispering them aloud like the younger nurses did. She worked fast and clean, the way Davies had taught her before the convoy hit and he stopped teaching her anything at all. It was during afternoon rounds, or what would have been afternoon rounds if time moved normally in the ICU, but it didn't. It moved in vital sign intervals and medication cycles, when Mercer appeared at the nursing station with his tablet and his air of someone who'd never once questioned his own authority. "Bennett." He didn't look up from his screen. "You're reassigned. Webb's primary care nurse, effective immediately. I want eyes on this case every 4 hours. Full vitals, I and OS, notify me of any changes, before they hit the monitor." He turned then, and she saw it, the calculation in his expression, the sense that he was positioning pieces on a board. She kept her own face neutral, the way you kept your hand steady during an extraction under fire. Mercer waited for her to acknowledge, and when she did, a simple nod, a "yes, doctor," something in his shoulders relaxed. He had no idea what he'd just done. He thought he was putting her under surveillance. He'd actually put her exactly where she needed to be. Where she could watch. Where she could see what was happening with Webb's care, and where she could keep noticing the things that had made her dangerous in the first place. 3 days into the assignment, Laura found the pattern. Every single one of Webb's cardiac panels was being routed to Mercer's private lab, a Mercer Cardiology Diagnostics, registered to an address in northwest Colorado Springs. She discovered it by accident, really, while reconciling the billing codes during a quiet stretch of the night shift. The charges were legitimate on their face, yes, but the timing was suspicious. Webb didn't need daily cardiac panels. His ejection fraction had stabilized, his troponin levels were normal, and his echocardiogram from admission showed no evidence of myocardial involvement. Yet the orders kept appearing in the system, authorized by Mercer, routed to his brother-in-law's lab, billed to Webb's insurance at $2,400 per panel. Laura had photographed the screens with her phone, careful, methodical, the way you document evidence when you know it might matter later, and then she deleted the photos from her phone's main library and hidden them in a secure folder buried 3 layers deep in her applications folder. She wasn't planning anything. She was just observing. Just collecting data. Pain was information, and information was power, and she'd learned a long time ago to gather it quietly. The real thing that made her feel like she was drowning came at 1,800 on day 5, when Webb's sedation was reduced slightly and his eyes opened and held hers for a moment too long. She was checking his Swan-Ganz catheter, verifying the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure reading, when he blinked with that particular quality of recognition that meant his brain was actively processing information, and she saw something flicker across his face, a question, maybe, or the ghost of memory trying to move through the pharmacological fog. She didn't change her expression. She didn't look away. She simply finished adjusting the line, stepped back, and continued her work. But her hands weren't steady anymore. Not because she was afraid. Because she recognized the exact moment when someone's subconscious understood something their conscious mind hadn't yet articulated. She'd felt that moment before, in the convoy right before it was hit, before Davies died, before everything became different. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was during the 1900 break, when the unit was in that brief pocket of relative quiet, that she allowed herself the 15 minutes she needed. The supply closet on the north end of the ICU was small, cluttered with boxes of gauze and bottles of normal saline and all the practical evidence of keeping people alive, and nobody really went back there because everything they needed was restocked automatically. Laura opened her locker, tucked behind the industrial mop sink, hidden from cameras, and withdrew the item she carried every single shift, the thing that grounded her when the weight of being no one became too much to carry. The flag was folded in the precise triangular shape of a military funeral, the fabric slightly faded from the heat of Davies's fingers in the moments after the convoy was hit, after she'd pulled him from the burning Hilux with rounds still coming through the windshield, after she realized his injuries were the kind that didn't leave room for the medic's optimism he was projecting through shattered teeth. She touched it now, the texture of it rough and familiar under her fingertips, and felt the trembling in her hands ease slightly. Davies. 2007. Kandahar Province. Spotter. Friend. Ghost. The things you carried when the Pentagon decided you'd never existed and the people you'd saved couldn't acknowledge your name. She held the flag for exactly 90 seconds, feeling the weight of invisibility settle back into place where it belonged, and then she folded it away again and returned to Bay 7. Mercer was waiting when she emerged. He stood at the nursing station with his characteristic posture, shoulders back, chin elevated slightly, the physical embodiment of someone who'd never once doubted his right to occupy space. His eyes tracked her movement with the precision of a predator, and she felt the shift in the room the way you feel air pressure change before a storm. He said nothing. He simply waited, his shadow falling across the workspace like a threat, and Laura understood in that moment that he was watching her the way a man watches something he intends to break. She didn't flinch. She never flinched. She simply moved past him toward Webb's monitor, toward the work that needed doing, toward the next 4 hours of being invisible and essential simultaneously. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer. The ventilator wheezed. The monitor beeped. And the woman wearing Captain Laura Bennett's face continued her shift, her hand steady, her eyes fixed on the data, waiting for the moment when everything changed. The Grand Rounds conference room at St. Michael's smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax. 20 residents in starched white coats sat in 3 neat rows, their pens poised above notebooks, waiting for instruction like disciples waiting for gospel. The fluorescent panel overhead cast a sickly pallor across everyone's face, turning skin the color of old bone. Dr. Mercer stood at the front with a laser pointer in his right hand, his left hand thrust into his trouser pocket, a posture Laura recognized as pure theater. He loved an audience. Here we have, Mercer's voice crackled through the speakers, projecting Laura's charting notes onto the screen behind him, Nurse Bennett's creative interpretation of protocol. The room didn't move. 30 eyes fixed on the clinical documentation. Laura stood at the back wall, hands clasped behind her back, jaw clenched so tight she could taste copper. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical complaint above. She did not blink. She did not flinch. Notice, Mercer continued, the laser pointer dancing across her handwriting like a red scorpion, how she questioned my order for a complete cardiac panel on a patient presenting with obvious chest symptoms. He turned to face the residents, his smile thin as a razor. And yet, she is not a cardiologist. Not even close. A resident in the second row, young, nervous, desperate to impress, scribbled frantically. Another whispered something to his neighbor. The neighbor's shoulders trembled with suppressed laughter. The patient's symptoms, Laura said quietly, didn't match the diagnostic criteria for cardiac intervention. Mercer's head tilted like a predator assessing prey. His voice dropped to a tone that made the air pressure in the room shift. And yet, I possess a medical degree from Johns Hopkins. I have published 43 peer-reviewed articles on cardiovascular pathology. What, precisely, is your credential, Nurse Bennett? A 2-year RN program from what institution exactly? 3-year BSN from the University of Colorado. Her voice was flat. Functional. A nurse's voice. Not a captain's voice. Not yet. How impressive, Mercer said, and the residents laughed on cue, a flock of birds responding to a predator's call. This is what happens when insufficient education meets overconfidence. These future physicians need to understand the hierarchy. The chain of command exists for a reason. Nurse Bennett clearly never learned her place in it. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. She turned and walked out, her pace measured, her posture unchanged. Behind her, Mercer's voice resumed its clinical lecture, dissecting her judgment, her competence, her entire understanding of medicine with the precision of a man who had absolute institutional power backing every syllable. The door hissed closed. In the corridor outside, the ICU stretched quiet and humming with monitors and ventilators. Laura made it 12 steps before her jaw unclenched enough to breathe. By the vending machines on the second floor, 2 nurses stood gossiping over lukewarm coffee. They were discussing the Grand Rounds. Laura approached from the left, her badge catching the overhead light. The conversation stopped like someone had cut a transmission line. Just the woman we were talking about, one of them said, Jennifer, from the day shift, a woman whose kids went to the same school as half the hospital staff. She exchanged a look with the other nurse, a senior RN named Carol who'd worked St. Michael's for 17 years and had never once questioned Dr. Mercer about anything. Laura opened the vending machine. The mechanism wheezed and dropped her coffee into the receptacle. She retrieved it without making eye contact. G.I. Jane, Jennifer mouthed to Carol, the words just loud enough. Both women laughed, the kind of laughter designed to be heard, designed to wound, designed to reinforce that some people belonged and others were tolerated only as long as they stayed quiet. Laura turned and left, her coffee in her left hand, her right hand steady at her side. She did not turn back. She did not acknowledge the whispers that followed her down the hallway. The trembling in her shoulders was not fear. The trembling was restraint, the kind that comes from 17 years in Delta Force operations, from surviving Kandahar without backup, from pulling Davies out of a burning Hilux with rounds snapping past her head like angry hornets. That trembling was the physical manifestation of a fist wrapped around a knife, never drawing it unless the situation demanded blood. The ICU was her destination. Colonel Webb's room was on the north wing, third door past the nursing station. But before she could reach it, a hand caught her elbow. Not hard. Not aggressive. Just a grip that communicated authority without requiring force. Dr. Mercer's office door was 10 feet away. He steered her inside with the casual confidence of a man who owned the space, the staff, and everyone in it. "I want to discuss your new assignment," he said, closing the door. His voice had shifted, no longer performing for residents. This was his actual voice. Quieter. More dangerous. Colonel Webb requires specialized attention. VIP patient, decorated service record, wealthy family connections. The sort of case where mistakes become lawsuits. Expensive lawsuits. Laura stood with her hands at her sides, waiting. "You've expressed such confidence in your own clinical judgment," Mercer continued, moving to his desk, perching against the edge as if they were friends having a casual conversation. "So I'm placing you directly on his care team. 24-hour observation. Everything by protocol. Everything documented. One mistake, Bennett, one deviation from my explicit orders, and I will have security escort you out in handcuffs. We have a zero-tolerance policy for insubordination in my unit." He paused. His smile was the smile of a wolf showing teeth before the bite. "I've also requested a full credential review with the Colorado Nursing Board," he continued. "Your military background came up. 3 years unaccounted for in the public record. Classified work, your resume states. Rather unusual for a nurse, wouldn't you say? Something about that doesn't add up. Something about you doesn't add up." Laura nodded once. Her jaw moved with the gesture, a visible acknowledgement, nothing more. She turned toward the door. "I'm not finished," Mercer said. She stopped. Did not turn around. Waited. "Colonel Webb is here for end-stage cardiomyopathy. His heart is failing. My cardiac panels are not optional. They are the standard of care. You will order them when I instruct you to order them. You will not question them. You will not make recommendations. You will be a nurse. Nothing more. Understood?" "Yes, Dr. Mercer," Laura said. She left the office. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing remained steady. The rage that had begun in grand rounds, fueled by the whispers by the vending machine, now had a target and a timeline. Mercer was not just arrogant, he was criminally careless. A man running a billing scheme through unnecessary cardiac panels. A man who ordered tests not for patients but for profit margins. A man whose brother-in-law owned a private diagnostic lab and received referrals from St. Michael's that never would have held scrutiny from actual quality control. She'd already documented 3 of them in Webb's chart, cardiac panels ordered on consecutive days, all routed to Mercer Medical Diagnostics, LLC, all with billing codes that looked almost legitimate until you actually read the clinical notes alongside them. Webb's symptoms did not warrant the testing. His ejection fraction was already documented. His enzyme levels were stable. The panels were pure fiction, pure profit, pure fraud disguised in the language of medicine. But she kept her face empty, kept her voice soft, kept walking. Webb's room was on the north wing, third door past the nursing station, just as she remembered. She entered at 2,200 hours, shift change, when the day nurses were handing off their cases and the night nurses were beginning their 12-hour vigil. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, beep, beep, beep on a percussion section of pharmacology and failing biology. Webb lay in the raised hospital bed, oxygen cannula beneath his nose, for lines running into both arms, the steady drip of medications keeping him comfortable. Keeping him sedated. Keeping him from too much awareness of his own deterioration. Laura checked his vitals. Blood pressure 118/72. Heart rate 84 and regular. O2 sat 94% on supplemental oxygen. Respiratory rate 18. All stable. All within acceptable parameters for a man in his 60s waiting for a heart transplant that probably wouldn't come in time. She was programming his next morphine dose when his eyes opened. They were clear eyes. Alert. Military eyes that had seen desert combat and survived it. He looked directly at her, focused, tracking, present in a way the morphine usually prevented. "You look familiar," he said, his voice rough from the oxygen, from the medications, from disuse. "Were you stationed overseas?" Laura's hands continued their work. She did not pause. She did not meet his gaze. She responded in the voice of a nurse, deferential, professional, empty of anything classified. "Lots of people serve, Colonel." "Rest now." "What's your name?" he asked. "Laura." First name only. First name only was all the ICU protocol required. She adjusted his oxygen flow, checked his foresights, moved through the motions of her assessment with the kind of efficiency that came from years of medical training. Not the 3 years the hospital believed she had. The 17 years she actually had, earned in field hospitals under mortar fire, in combat situations where mistakes meant funerals and letters home to families who would never know what happened to their sons, their fathers, their brothers. Webb closed his eyes. The morphine pulled him back under like an undertow. His breathing deepened. Within 2 minutes, he was asleep. Laura stood at the foot of his bed, watching him, computing the variables. She accessed his service record from the medical system using her employee credentials. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines at first. Then reassignment to JSOC Task Force 121. Then the dates aligned with her own service record, with the mission in Kandahar, with Operation Phantom Echo, with the moment classified operations went sideways and the Pentagon decided a scapegoat was necessary. Webb had been rotated to Delta Force as part of the cleanup. He'd taken her slot. He'd filled the position created by her erasure. He didn't know. The woman standing at the end of his bed, monitoring his cardiac function, documenting his decline, checking his unnecessary cardiac panels, he had no idea who she actually was. No idea that the ghost whose boots he'd filled 17 years ago was now the one keeping him alive. Just after 100 hours, an hour when hospitals emptied out and the night shift grew thin and vigilant, Laura found Mercer in the hallway outside Webb's window. He stood with his arms crossed, watching the unconscious colonel through the glass partition. The late-night ICU had a different energy than daytime, quieter, more intense, the way violence is quieter than chaos. "Problem, Doctor?" Laura asked. Mercer turned. His eyes moved across her face, cataloging, assessing. "Just making sure our VIP patient gets the attention he deserves. No shortcuts, Bennett. Everything by the book. Everything documented." He walked past her, his footsteps echoing down the tile corridor, and then he was gone. Laura returned to the monitoring station. Webb's chart sat open, his vitals streaming across the screen. She reviewed the 3 cardiac panels Mercer had ordered, all unnecessary, all profitable, all routed to his brother-in-law's lab. She took a screenshot of each one, saved them to a secure location she'd created earlier in the shift. Evidence. Documentation. The kind of paper trail that either saved a career or buried one. At 02 for 5 hours, every alarm in Webb's room screamed at once. His heart rate spiked. His blood pressure dropped like a stone falling down a well. The monitors showed a pattern Laura recognized instantly: thoracic aortic dissection. Catastrophic. His aneurysm, already documented in his admissions paperwork, had ruptured. She hit the code button with her left hand and reached for the crash cart with her right hand. The ICU exploded into motion, nurses converging from everywhere, the rapid response team moving with the choreography of people who'd done this 100 times. But the cardiothoracic surgeon on call was 20 minutes out. Maybe less. Maybe more. Webb had 4 minutes, maybe 3. His systolic pressure was below 70. The hiss of his labored breathing filled the room like a siren. This was the moment. This was the threshold between what she'd allowed herself to become and what she actually was. The monitor's alarm screamed at 0300 hours like a siren nobody wanted to hear. Laura was already moving before the second beep registered in her cortex. The sound had become the language she spoke fluently, the one that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to muscle memory preserved in her shoulders and hands. Webb's blood pressure had been drifting down the graph all night like a stone in deep water, each reading a few points lower than the last. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger panic, just a slow whisper that something inside his chest was beginning to fail. 78 over 52. Then 71 over 48. Then 64 over 39. His heart rate had climbed to 144 beats per minute, the rhythm irregular, the kind of tachycardia that meant his body was screaming for blood it wasn't getting. She'd been checking him every 15 minutes for the last 2 hours, watching the parabola arc downward with the precision of someone who'd learned to read dying in a field hospital outside Kandahar where the only instruments were hands and intuition and the absolute refusal to accept that someone on your watch was going to flatline on a stretcher. Webb's eyes fluttered open when she reached for his wrist, finding the pulse point with 2 fingers the way she'd done it 1,000 times before, not searching for it with hesitation but placing her fingertips where the artery had to be, where physics and anatomy guaranteed it would be there, thrumming weak and fast like a bird's heart in a closed fist. His lips moved but no sound came out. The endotracheal tube that had been sitting in his throat since the first code blue prevented speech entirely, left him locked inside his own body with only the metrics Laura could read from the machine surrounding him. His oxygen saturation was climbing, that was good, that meant the ventilator was working, but his pressure kept descending like an elevator with cut cables. She'd seen this pattern before. She'd lived this pattern before. The thoracic aortic aneurysm didn't announce itself with the courtesy of a warning. It just tore itself open, and the blood that was supposed to stay inside the vessel wall started leaking into the space where it was never supposed to go, and the body's electrical system started misfiring like a building burning from the inside out. She moved to the bedside phone and pressed the button for the on-call cardiothoracic surgeon's cell with the kind of calm that comes from having already made the decision that nobody in this hospital had the authority to stop what was about to happen. The phone rang twice before Dr. Castellano answered, his voice still carrying the texture of interrupted sleep. "It's Bennett, ICU, St. Michael's. Colonel Webb's pressure is bottoming out. Heart rate's 144 and irregular. I'm reading aneurysm rupture." Castellano's voice sharpened immediately, the sleep burning away in real time. "I'm in Westminster. ETA 23 minutes. Start him on vasopressors, get 2 units of O-negative typing and crossing, call anesthesia to be ready for." Laura had already pulled open the medication drawer before he finished speaking, had already drawn up the dopamine that was meant to keep blood vessels clamped tight and pressure from catastrophizing. She hung up without saying goodbye because there was no time for the courtesy of conversation, no seconds available for the social rituals that separated normal communication from the kind of exchange that happened when people understood that another human being was circling down toward a void from which no medical intervention could retrieve him if they waited for conventional timelines and bureaucratic procedure. The dopamine infusion started flowing through Webb's for line at 0305. Within 90 seconds, his pressure ticked up 4 points. Within 2 minutes, it had climbed to 68 over 36. It was like watching someone try to fill a bathtub with water while the drain remained open. The numbers improved but they remained fundamentally unstable. the kind of precarious stability that wouldn't hold. The aorta was still bleeding. The medicines could keep him alive for maybe another 12 minutes, maybe 13 if the 4 fluids she'd bolused continued to maintain enough circulating volume. The cardiothoracic surgeon was in Westminster. Colorado Springs lay between Westminster and here like a geography problem nobody had time to solve. Laura stared at the monitor, and the decision crystallized in her chest with the clarity of gunfire. She'd spent 18 months hiding who she actually was, had worn the invisibility of the overlooked nurse-like armor, had let Dr. Mercer and his residents and the entire hierarchical apparatus of this hospital's authority structure believe that she was exactly what her resume claimed, a competent ICU nurse with no background beyond the conventional trajectory of civilian medical training. But there were moments when invisibility became a liability, when the person you'd erased from your own history couldn't stay dead anymore because somebody else's death was scheduled for 15 minutes away. Webb didn't know the woman checking his vitals was the ghost whose boots he'd filled. But that fact didn't change the truth written in every fiber of her hands, in the reflexes that had been soldered into her nervous system by a decade of making instant decisions in environments where the only alternative to action was watching people die. She moved to the code button on the wall and pressed it with the flat of her palm. The overhead intercom crackled and a voice asked, "Code Blue, location." Laura answered, "ICU, bed 12. All personnel respond." Then she was already moving toward the medication supplies, pulling the crash cart closer to Webb's bed with movements that had the economical precision of someone who knew exactly what she needed and in what order she needed it. The door burst open and 2 surgical residents came through at near sprint, their scrubs still showing the creases from lying in the on-call room less than 5 minutes earlier. Behind them came the respiratory therapist, whose name was Garcia and who'd worked enough codes with Laura over the past 6 months to understand that she didn't panic, didn't waste breath on unnecessary words, did things with purpose. A nursing supervisor appeared in the doorway, her name badge reading Supervisor Chen, her expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone about to watch something happen that her 20 years of hospital administration hadn't quite prepared her for. Laura looked directly at Chen without breaking stride. "Get me a scalpel kit and rib spreaders. Now." The words came out as a statement, not a request, the kind of voice that belonged to someone accustomed to being obeyed by people whose lives depended on the speed of their compliance. Chen hesitated for maybe 2 seconds, her brain visibly processing the anomaly. Nurses didn't request surgical supplies during codes, physicians did, before Laura's voice cut through the calculus. "He's got minutes. The surgeon's in Westminster. Move." The supervisor moved. The residents continued to stare, their mouths slightly open, the expression of people watching a subordinate suddenly speak in a language they didn't know she was fluent in. Garcia had already moved to Webb's head and began setting up for rapid sequence intubation, the movements quick and practiced. The endotracheal tube slid home, the syringe pulled back to check for air return, the tube taped into position with the kind of practiced efficiency that marked him as someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The ventilator's rhythmic mechanical wheeze filled the room, a sound like tide going in and out but mechanical, precise, relentless. Laura prepped Webb's chest with betadine, the antiseptic smell suddenly dominating the room like iodine and copper mixed together, and she didn't let herself think about the fact that she was about to crack open a United States military officer's ribs in a hospital room in Colorado Springs, that she was about to become something she couldn't become the moment the scalpel blade touched tissue. Chen returned with the supplies, her arms full of the instruments that looked like torture devices to someone who'd never seen them used for their intended purpose. Laura took the scalpel without words, without ceremony, without the luxury of hesitation. She marked the 5th intercostal space with her fingertip, finding the landmarks by muscle memory the way someone else might find their phone in a dark pocket. The incision came first, a clean line along the ribs, the blade moving with the kind of precision that came from having done this before, from having done this in a tent outside Kandahar while Davies held a flashlight in his teeth and watched the pilot's chest to see if it was still moving. The bleeding was minimal because she'd been trained to cut in the exact way that avoided the arteries that ran along the rib edges. Her hands moved on their own. The rib spreaders went in next, the retractor spreading the ribs apart like pages of a book, exposing the thoracic cavity with a sound like tearing wood. Webb's aorta came into view, and she could see it instantly, the tear in the wall, the blood that had been leaking into the mediastinal space, pooling against the heart's outer membrane like a slow death in progress. The residents were making sounds now, small gasps, the kind of involuntary reactions that came from witnessing something that wasn't in any training manual they'd been given. Laura grabbed the hemostatic clamp from the surgical field and applied pressure to the aortic branch that was bleeding like a fountain. The bleeding stopped. The pressure on the monitor, which had continued its descent while she worked, suddenly stabilized. 68. 70. 74. The O2 saturation climbed from 82 to 91 to 98. The heart rate, no longer in panic mode as the body registered that blood was actually staying inside the vessel wall again, began its descent from the terrifying altitude of 144 to something that resembled normal human physiology. She tied off the bleeding vessel with sutures, her movements the kind of automatic precision that came from having done this under mortar fire, with Davies holding a headlamp in a bomb-cratered tent, with nothing but her own hand standing between another human being and the void. The room had gone absolutely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sounds were the ventilator's mechanical tide, the monitor's persistent beeping, and the small snip of surgical scissors as she worked. At 0308, the cardiothoracic surgeon arrived, his presence announced by the doors slamming open like a gunshot. Dr. Castellano was 58, had the bearing of someone who'd trained at Johns Hopkins, had the kind of reputation that preceded him like a pressure wave. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Webb's open chest, the clean clamp work, the sutured branches, the sternum about to be closed by hands that weren't supposed to be holding a needle driver in an ICU. His eyes moved to Laura. His expression moved through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been recognition. Who did this? His voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that came from understanding he was standing in the presence of something that didn't fit the conventional architecture of what a hospital nurse was supposed to be. Laura finished the last suture, pulled the sternal retractor free, and met his gaze. Patient was crashing. Surgeon was 23 minutes away. She didn't explain. Didn't justify. Didn't offer the elaborate narrative that civilians always seem to require to understand why rules had been broken. Castellano moved closer, examined the clamp work, traced the suture lines with his eyes like he was reading something written in a language he'd spent his entire career learning to interpret. "This is military-grade field medicine," he said quietly. "Where did you?" But that was the moment when the hallway erupted. That was the moment when Dr. Mercer crashed through the ICU doors like something released from a cage, his face the color of a bruised plum, his voice a scream that rattled the fluorescent lights in their fixtures. "What is happening in my hospital?" His eyes found Laura at the bedside, found the open chest, found the surgical instruments, and something broke behind his eyes, not anger but the specific rage of a man whose entire carefully constructed reality had just been set on fire. "Get away from that patient. Now." His voice was the voice of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, to the kind of institutional authority that made people move without questioning. But nobody moved. Not the residents. Not Garcia. Not Castellano. Not Laura. And that's when the real nightmare began. The scalpel kit sat in Laura's hands before the words fully registered. Supervisor Chen hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for the machines to scream Colonel Webb's oxygen saturation into the basement, then nodded. The kit arrived. Rib spreaders came next. No one asked questions when a patient's blood pressure bottomed out at 54 systolic and the attending was chasing his own tail with a phone pressed to his ear. Laura's hands didn't shake. They never did. The initial incision came first, muscle memory moving through her fingers like water finding its path downhill. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. 5th intercostal space. The blade parted skin and subcutaneous tissue with a surgeon's precision, but Laura wasn't thinking like a surgeon. She was thinking like a medic in the Panjshir Valley outside Kandahar, where a young lieutenant had taken shrapnel to the chest and the only option between death and a chance was a field knife and steady hands. Pain was information. Bleeding was data. The human body was a machine, and machines could be fixed if you knew which part was broken. The ribs spread open with the sound of wood cracking under pressure. There. The thoracic aorta, torn like a fraying rope. Blood pooled dark and urgent in the cavity. No time for elegant sutures or careful hemostasis. This was damage control. Laura's right hand moved to the bleeder with the touch of someone who had done this before, not in a sterile OR with anesthesia and a full team, but under mortar fire with nothing but a combat knife and the knowledge that the man bleeding out in her lap had a family waiting in Fort Bragg. Her fingers clamped the vessel, and the hiss of air escaping from the endotracheal tube became the only sound in the room. O2 sat rising. 71, 76. 82. The cardiac monitor shifted from chaotic fibrillation back toward something resembling a rhythm. Sinus rhythm. 78 beats per minute. Perfusion. She didn't look up. The closure was mechanical now, sutures placed with the economical precision of someone who knew every second counted and wasted motion was wasted blood. Her hands moved across the incision site like they were reading Braille, feeling for any other source of bleeding, any other reason Colonel Marcus Webb might not wake up. The anesthesiologist stared at her over his mask. The attending had stopped pacing. The room held its breath the way operating rooms do when they realize they're watching something that shouldn't be possible. That was when Dr. Mercer arrived. His shadow fell across the surgical field first. His voice followed, cracking like he'd swallowed gravel. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His face had gone the color of old concrete, purple-gray with rage. "That is a surgical procedure. You are a nurse." Laura tied the final knot without looking up. Her voice came out flat, conversational, the way you discuss the weather. "Patient would have died. You practice medicine without a license." Mercer stepped forward, and she could smell the coffee on his breath, the fear underneath the anger. "You opened a human chest cavity without authorization. That's a felony, Bennett." "A felony?" The cardiothoracic surgeon, who had been standing in the doorway for the last 90 seconds, watching, stepped into the light. "Actually, her technique is flawless. I've seen residents take 4 times as long with half the precision. She saved his life." Mercer ignored him completely. His phone was already in his hand, and Laura watched him make the calculation, the call he'd been threatening for 3 weeks, the one that would transform him from a man with a personal grudge into a man with institutional power. He scrolled through his contacts with his thumb. "I'm calling administration. And the state licensing board. Bennett, you're done." The rain came later. By 0600 hours, Laura sat in the HR director's office on the 3rd floor, the fluorescent panels overhead casting everything in the color of dead skin. Mercer stood behind the director's chair with his arms crossed like a vulture waiting for something to stop breathing. The director, a woman named Castellano who Laura had never seen smile, read from a script written for people who had already made their decision. Practicing outside scope of licensure. Performing surgical procedures without supervision. Insubordination. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. Laura's jaw clenched once. That was all. No defense. No tears. No voice that wavered or hands that trembled. She simply stood, the movement economical and calm, and followed the security guard, a kid who looked maybe 23, uncomfortable in his uniform, down to the locker room on the 2nd floor. His radio crackled static. He avoided her eyes. The cardboard box came from the supply closet. It had once held surgical gloves, and it still smelled faintly of latex and warehouse dust. Laura packed methodically. The cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a gift from a med student 3 years ago, when the world still knew who Captain Laura Bennett was supposed to be. A half-dead succulent sitting on the shelf since last winter, somehow still clinging to life. The photograph of Davies grinning in his plate carrier, Delta Force crest visible over his shoulder, the image taken 2 days before an IED ended everything in a rural province no American was supposed to be in. And beneath it, wrapped in brown paper like a secret, the folded flag. She didn't notice Mercer in the doorway until he spoke. "You should have stayed in your lane, G.I. Jane." His voice had lost its institutional weight now, reduced to something personal and small. "That credential investigation I mentioned? It's already with the state board. Whatever you're hiding in that past of yours, I'll find it. And whatever clearance you're hiding under, it won't matter once the board gets done with you." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just won something. "Colonel Webb? He'll never even know your name." Laura finished packing. The box balanced against her hip like she'd carried boxes like this before, which she had, in barracks and safe houses and the backs of transport planes with the ramp door open to the dark. She walked past Mercer without acknowledging him. Her scrubs were still damp from the night shift, clinging to her shoulders and back, and the basement exit had flooded again this season, creating a small river of stale water across the loading dock. Academy Boulevard was empty at dawn. The rain fell in sheets that hammered the pavement like applause for something nobody wanted to celebrate. Laura stood at the bus stop with the cardboard box balanced on her hip, watching St. Michael's disappear behind curtains of grey water. The flag inside the box was the only thing that felt real. Everything else, the hospital, the termination letter signed in blue ink, the security guard's uncomfortable salute as she left, felt like ghosts, like things that happened to someone else, someone with a name and a history and a future that didn't end at a bus stop in Colorado Springs with no job, no clearance, and a photograph of a dead man as her only credential. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part would arrive 3 weeks later, in the form of an ambulance and a name Laura thought she'd left in the mountains of Kandahar forever. The worst part would walk through the emergency room doors and change everything she'd been trying to keep hidden. The worst part would have her name on his lips in a language the hospital staff couldn't understand, and it would echo through the corridors like a ghost refusing to stay buried. For now, though, there was only the rain and the box and the flag. Laura Bennett stood at the edge of invisibility and waited for the next bus to take her away from the life that no longer claimed her. 3 weeks. 21 days of filing insurance claims at the registration desk through a temp agency that paid $14 an hour, of watching doctors walk past without seeing her, of wondering if anyone would ever need to know who she'd been. The rain had stopped. Colorado Springs held its breath in that peculiar October stillness where the mountains looked like they could topple over from their own weight. The ambulance doors burst open at 2,247 hours. Gunshot wound, left flank, gas station robbery 3 blocks from the university. The paramedics wheeled the stretcher past her desk, a dark-haired man in his early 40s, hand pressed to his side, eyes rolling with shock and pain. Laura didn't look up. She'd learned not to look up anymore. She typed admission information into a computer that hummed like it was dying, the fluorescent lights casting her hands in a sickly white that made them look like they belonged to a corpse. The ER attending called for a trauma bay. Standard procedure. Nothing that required her attention. The man on the stretcher turned his head as they passed, and his eyes locked on hers for exactly 1 second. Then recognition bloomed across his face like a detonation. "Phantom," he whispered in Pashto. Not shouted. Whispered, like a prayer. "Phantom, is that you?" The keyboard stopped. Her hands froze mid-keystroke. Kareem Ormodi. The translator they'd extracted from that burning Hilux in Kandahar when his cover was blown, when 3 Taliban fighters had torched the vehicle he was hiding in, when Laura had gone back in through smoke that tasted like diesel and burnt flesh. She'd pulled him out with his right arm shattered at the elbow, had applied a pressure dressing with field-expedient materials, had carried him 400 meters to the extraction point while rounds cracked overhead like breaking glass. She hadn't seen his face in 19 years. "Get him to Trauma 1, the attending barked, and the orderlies wheeled him away. But Kareem's eyes had stayed on hers for those final seconds, recognition, confusion, gratitude, questions that had no safe answers collapsing into a single moment of impossible connection. Laura's jaw clenched. Not from fear. From something much harder to name. From the weight of being seen after so long in the dark. 40 minutes later, a Marine Corps liaison in dress blues walked through the ER doors with a folder and a look of grim purpose that made the air in the hallway thicken. He asked for the administrator. He asked for Dr. Mercer specifically. He asked questions that began to spread through the hospital like ripples. Why was a military officer here? Why the classified folder? What had the temp agency nurse from registration done? They moved to the conference room on the 3rd floor. Laura watched from the hallway as Mercer walked in, his face already flushed with indignation, his voice already raised about HIPAA violations and unauthorized personnel. The Marine Corps liaison gestured for Laura to enter. She walked in slowly. Measured. The way someone walks who has nothing to lose because everything worth keeping had already been taken from them. Captain Laura Bennett, the Marine began, opening the classified folder. His voice was formal, the cadence of official ceremony. Your service record has been declassified for purposes of this recognition. You are credited with 17 lives saved under direct fire, including the extraction of 3 coalition personnel from a compromised position in Kandahar Province, Operation Phantom Echo, 2005. Mercer's face went purple. What is this? What the hell is she? She's a registered nurse with a questionable work history, Anne. Your investigation into Captain Bennett's credentials, the Marine continued without pause, triggered Pentagon security protocols. During the review process, forensic accountants cross-referenced your hospital billing records with those protocols. They found some irregularities. I don't know what you're talking about. But Mercer's voice had changed. It had cracked slightly, like old leather. The door opened. A 2-star general entered. Full dress uniform. Ribbons arranged like a soldier's autobiography. Everyone stood. Mercer didn't seem to understand what was happening, his mouth opened and closed, his hand reaching for the back of the chair like he might need to sit down. The general saluted. Not to Mercer. To the shadow box a second lieutenant was holding, the case containing ribbons and medals that somehow looked both impossible and inevitable. Bronze Star. Meritorious Service Medal. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Commendation Medal. And at the end of the row, a Navy Cross. The decoration Mercer had once mocked as at participation trophies when Laura had mentioned, in passing, that she'd been honored to serve. The general handed her the box. His eyes held something that looked like recognition. Captain, your country is grateful. The record will reflect your service. And we have some additional matters to discuss regarding Dr. Mercer's conduct. That was when the FBI agent entered with a laptop. He set it on the conference table, opened it, and projected documents in columns and rows. Every cardiac panel Mercer had ordered for the past 6 years. Every billing code. Every test that Laura had flagged as unnecessary. Every test that had been routed to Mercer Medical Diagnostics LLC, a lab owned by his brother-in-law, with kickback payments that vary between $300 and $700 per referral. We're looking at approximately $800,000 in fraudulent billing, the FBI agent said quietly. Medicare fraud. Patient endangerment. Abuse of your medical license. You have the right to remain silent. Mercer's voice came out as a whisper. I've been here 15 years. I have patience. I have? Your privileges at St. Michael's are revoked effective immediately, the hospital board chairman said, holding up a letter. Your medical license is suspended pending criminal trial. You'll be contacted by our legal team regarding your final paycheck and the details of your transition out of this institution. The silence that followed was so complete that Laura could hear the hum of the ventilation system, the distant beep of a cardiac monitor from a patient 3 floors below, the sound of her own breathing, steady and calm and completely without mercy. Mercer looked at her through the glass wall that separated the conference room from the hallway. His eyes searched her face for something, satisfaction, maybe, or triumph, or proof that she'd orchestrated this revenge. What he found instead was nothing. Her expression was blank. Professional. The same mask she'd worn when he mocked her in grand rounds, when he'd reassigned her to the ICU, when he'd walked her to the parking lot in the rain and smiled like he'd won something that had never been his to claim. The absence of emotion somehow broke him more than any response would have. The hospital board chairman approached Laura in the hallway as she was leaving the conference room. Captain Bennett, the Pentagon would like to formally acknowledge your service. We owe you an apology for the way you were treated here. Laura nodded once. Colonel Webb. Is he recovering? Full recovery, the cardiothoracic surgeon answered, stepping out of the crowd that had gathered. He's been asking about the nurse who saved him. About how you knew what to do. About the techniques you used. The surgeon paused. Some of those techniques aren't standard training for ICU nurses. Webb himself appeared in the doorway then, still in a hospital gown but moving under his own power, for stand rolling beside him like an anchor he'd learned to carry. He looked at Laura, and she saw the exact moment recognition clicked into place. Not just recognition, understanding. I know you, he said. His voice was rough from the intubation tube but steady. You were on the Kandahar team. Before I got there. He studied her face like he was reading a map. They said you died. They said you were killed in that operation and they covered it up because of some classified. He stopped. He didn't need to finish. The shadow box on the conference table said everything. Laura's hands were still steady. Her voice was still level. You should rest, Colonel. Your surgical site needs time to heal. Your name, Webb said. Your real name. Not the one the hospital used. She met his eyes. For the first time in 3 weeks, in 3 years, in 19 years, she let someone see her. Captain Laura Bennett. 75th Ranger Regiment Attaché, Delta Force Support Operations. Kandahar Province, 2005. And yes, they erased me. The room held its breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Webb saluted. Not the casual hospital salute of gratitude, but a full military salute, fist to chest, eyes forward, the gesture of one soldier acknowledging another. Karim Omodi emerged from the ER waiting room, his arm in a fresh sling, and saluted as well. Then the Marine Corps liaison. Then the general. Then the cardiothoracic surgeon and the nurses in the hallway and the orderlies who didn't know who Laura Bennett was but understood that someone important had just walked back into the light. 6 months later, the White House ceremony room smelled like polished wood and pressed uniforms. Laura stood in her dress uniform, captain's bars gleaming on her shoulders, as the Defense Secretary pinned the National Defense Service Medal to her chest. The citation was read aloud: Valor under fire, extraction of personnel, leadership in classified operations, service above and beyond the call of duty. The audience included Karim Omodi, now a U.S. citizen working as a translator for the State Department. Colonel Webb, fully recovered, in dress blues. The cardiothoracic surgeon. The general who'd arrived at St. Michael's to set things right. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She accepted the medal and the applause with the composure of someone who understood that recognition was a luxury, but work was eternal. The news reported that Dr. Mercer was teaching CPR to community college students at Pikes Peak for $15 an hour. His medical license was gone. His career was gone. The criminal trial was pending. He watched from his small apartment as Laura's ceremony aired on the news, saw the uniform and the medals and the salutes, and understood finally that he'd never had any power at all. Power, he learned, isn't a title. Power is the ability to help. Everything else is just noise. Laura's new office at the Colorado Springs VA Hospital overlooked the mountains. She directed the Combat Veteran Surgical Recovery Program, training nurses and medics in the techniques she'd learned in places that no longer appeared on any map. Davies' folded flag sat on her bookshelf, next to her shadow box. Colonel Webb stopped by with coffee sometimes. Karim called every month to check in. And every morning, when Laura arrived for her shift, she looked in the mirror at a woman with captain's bars on her shoulders and understood that some ghosts could finally rest. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes no one's supposed to know about. Like this video if you believe hidden strength matters. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?